Court documents from Wilkinson County, Georgia, reveal a chilling incident from October 14th, 1839, when 5 plantation overseers entered the treacherous Ojai River swamp in pursuit of a 5-year-old girl who knew those wild lands like her own breath. 36 hours later, only one man, staggered out, broken, trembling, and unable to form clear words for nearly 3 weeks. Though the coroner officially blamed the deaths of the other 4 on harsh swamp conditions, witnesses noticed something far more disturbing. The survivor's hands were gashed with strange, deliberate patterns, and day after day he drew the same eerie symbol in the dirt outside the county jail. A local native later claimed the symbol meant, "The hunted becomes the hunter." For generations, the families of those overseers have avoided speaking of that night, while the original report mysteriously vanished from county records in 1847. What truly happened in those haunted woods has been intentionally erased. Buried beneath silence and fear, yet fragments of forgotten testimony whisper a truth capable of shaking anyone who believes power lies only in numbers. Before we uncover what really occurred in those cursed Georgia bottomlands, make sure you subscribe to Vintage Chains for more dark historical mysteries that time tried to erase. And tell us in the comments which country are you watching from. Write your country name below and become part of the Vintage Chains legacy. Now, let's discover what really happened when 5 men made the fatal mistake of underestimating their prey. The events that followed would reveal something far more disturbing than simple wilderness tragedy. They would expose how thoroughly knowledge of the land could transform victim into survivor and pursuer into prey. Wilkinson County, Georgia, in 1839 occupied a peculiar position in the state's geography. Too far from Savannah's coastal aristocracy to attract refined planters, too close to Creek Indian territories that had only recently been forcibly removed to attract cautious investors. The county's plantations were smaller operations owned by men who'd come to Georgia after failing in the Carolinas, desperate to extract profit from land that fought cultivation at every turn. The Hoopie River bottomlands that bordered the county's eastern edge had a reputation. Even before the creek removal of 1836, the indigenous population had treated those particular swamps with caution. The waterways shifted with seasonal floods, creating new channels that could disorient even experienced hunters. Cypress trees grew so dense in sections that sunlight never reached the forest floor, and the constant moisture bred vegetation that could hide a person 3 feet away. Spanish moss hung in curtains thick enough to obscure entire pathways, and the ground itself was treacherous. Solid earth that could become sucking mud within 10 paces. The Gresham plantation sat on the western edge of these bottomlands. 400 acres of struggling cotton worked by 37 enslaved people. Thomas Gresham had purchased the property in 1834 after a series of bad crop seasons in South Carolina left him bankrupt. He'd mortgaged everything to restart in Georgia, and 5 years later, he still operated at the edge of financial ruin. His cotton yields were half what neighboring plantations produced, his land exhausted faster than he could clear new fields, and his labor force was, in his words, unmanageable. Gresham employed 5 overseers, an unusually high number for a plantation of his size, but he insisted it was necessary. His enslaved workers, he claimed, required constant supervision. The truth, whispered among neighboring planters' wives, was that Gresham's overseers were men no other plantation would hire. They'd been dismissed for excessive brutality from operations in Alabama and Mississippi, places where brutality was already commonplace. Gresham hired them because they worked cheap and asked no questions. Jacob Yarrow was the head overseer, a man of 42 who'd worked plantations since age 15. He was methodical in his cruelty, keeping detailed records of punishments administered and calculating exactly how much suffering a person could endure before productivity declined. His younger brother, Samuel Yarrow, served as his assistant, equally systematic but lacking Jacob's restraint. The 3 other overseers, Nathaniel Cruz, William Tyson, and Henry Burke, were younger men who'd gravitated to Gresham's plantation because it gave them license to indulge their worst impulses without consequence. Among the enslaved population at Gresham Plantation was a girl named Celia, 15 years old in October 1839. Her mother had been Creek Indian, captured during the conflicts preceding the removal, subsequently sold into slavery despite questionable legality. Her father had been African, brought to Georgia through the illegal slave trade that continued despite federal prohibition. Celia had inherited her mother's knowledge of the bottomlands and her father's mechanical aptitude. She could navigate terrain that confused others and fashion tools from materials most people would overlook. Celia worked the plantation's vegetable gardens, a position that theoretically kept her closer to the main house, away from the field overseer's constant supervision. But Thomas Gresham's wife had died 2 years earlier, leaving no one to manage domestic affairs, and the overseer's attention had increasingly turned towards Celia as she matured. She'd learned to move quietly, to anticipate when trouble was coming, to make herself small and unnoticeable. The creek removal had affected the Gresham plantation more than most. Several of the enslaved population had maintained relationships with nearby creek communities, trading knowledge and occasionally food. When the Indians were forced west, these connections severed abruptly. But Celia's mother had taught her daughter everything before dying of fever in 1838. How to read the forest, identify edible plants, find clean water, recognize animal behavior, navigate by stars and moss, and tree growth patterns. This knowledge was about to become the difference between life and death. October 14th, 1839, began with fog so thick it obscured the plantation buildings from each other. The cotton still needed picking despite the visibility, and the enslaved workers moved into the fields at dawn, as always. Celia carried water between the rows, a task that kept her visible to multiple workers, a learned survival strategy. Around mid-morning, Samuel Yarrow approached her with instructions to report to the overseer's cabin. Celia recognized the tone, had learned to read the particular way he looked at her. She'd been avoiding this moment for months, but the summons was direct, and refusal would bring immediate consequences. She walked toward the cabin, but instead of entering, she continued walking past the building toward the eastern property line toward the bottomlands. Behind her, she heard Samuel's shout of surprise, then anger. She didn't run yet. Running would signal guilt, would give them justification. She walked with purpose, as though following instructions. But when Samuel's shouts brought the other overseers, when she heard multiple voices, and the particular excitement that came into men's voices when they sensed pursuit, she ran. The bottomlands began abruptly, solid ground transitioning to swamp with little warning. Celia hit the treane at full speed, bare feet, finding purchase on ground that would have tripped someone wearing boots. Behind her, the voices multiplied. Not just Samuel now, but Jacob's authoritative commands and the younger overseer's eager responses. Thomas Gresham himself appeared as the 5 overseers grabbed rifles and rope. A later testimony from a field worker reported hearing Gresham tell them to bring her back unspoiled because damaged property couldn't be sold and he needed every asset he could liquidate. Jacob Yarrow's response, overheard by the same witness, was less concerned with property value. The 5 men entered the forest 15 minutes behind Celia. They carried rifles, knives, rope, and the absolute confidence that comes from never having experienced consequences. They'd tracked runaways before, always successfully. A 5-year-old girl alone in the wilderness would be found within hours, terrified and compliant. The Ojai bottomlands were dangerous, yes, but not to armed men familiar with forest pursuit. What they didn't know was that Celia had been preparing for this moment since her mother's death. She'd been carrying supplies into the forest during water runs, a knife stolen from the kitchen hidden in rotting logs, a tinderbox wrapped in oilcloth buried in a hollow tree, dried meat taken piece by piece from the smokehouse, cached in waterproof pouches her mother had taught her to make from animal bladders. She'd memorized every pathway her mother had shown her, every seasonal route through the swamps, every high-ground island invisible to outsiders. The 5 men expected to find a terrified child. They would discover something entirely different. The first day of pursuit seemed to confirm the overseer's expectations. They found Celia's trail easily. Broken branches, disturbed vegetation, the occasional footprint in mud. Jacob Yarrow, experienced tracker, pointed out each sign with satisfaction. The trail led deeper into the bottomlands, away from neighboring plantations where she might have sought help, into wilderness that would exhaust and disorient her. They followed methodically, pacing themselves, expecting to find her collapsed from exhaustion before nightfall. The younger overseers joked about what would happen when they caught her, each comment crueler than the last. Jacob let them talk, knowing that anticipation made men careless, but also knowing this pursuit would end like all the others, with submission and punishment and a return to proper order. But as afternoon stretched toward evening, the trail began to behave strangely. It seemed to double back on itself, crossing previous paths in ways that suggested confusion. They'd find clear signs of passage, then nothing for stretches, then signs again in unexpected locations. Samuel Yarrow suggested she was lost, wandering randomly. But Jacob studied the patterns with growing unease. The randomness seemed almost deliberate, designed to keep them moving in circles. When darkness came, they made camp on a relatively dry hummock, lighting a fire that illuminated the hanging moss like curtains around them. They took turns on watch, 2 men sleeping while 3 stayed alert. But the night passed without incident. The forest around them was loud with animal sounds, frogs and insects, and occasional larger creatures moving through underbrush, but no sign of the girl. Dawn revealed something that disturbed even Jacob's confidence. Their packs had been opened during the night, not violently torn or scattered, but carefully searched. Food was missing, not all of it, but selected items. Dried beef, hardtack, a canteen. William Tyson insisted he'd been awake, watching, but had seen nothing. The moss curtains had hung motionless. The fire had burned steadily, yet someone had moved among their supplies without detection. The 5 men looked at each other with the first flickers of uncertainty. A terrified runaway didn't steal food with surgical precision from armed men. This behavior suggested planning confidence and, most disturbing of all, complete comfort moving through darkness that disoriented them even with firelight. Jacob made the decision to continue pursuit. But the dynamic had shifted. They weren't hunting a fleeing child anymore. They were following something that understood the forest better than they did. Something that had deliberately led them deep into unfamiliar territory. Something that had approached their camp with enough stealth to take supplies while they watched. The trail resumed that morning, clearer now, almost as though she wanted them to follow. Samuel suggested turning back, but Jacob pointed out the practical problem. They'd traveled far enough into the bottomlands that returning meant admitting failure to Gresham meant acknowledging they'd been outmaneuvered by a teenage girl. Their reputations as overseers depended on dominance, on never showing weakness. They had to find her. By midday of the second day, Nathaniel Cruz noticed something that made him stop walking. The trees around them bore markings, not random natural damage, but deliberate scratches and patterns. Creek symbols, he thought, though he couldn't read them. The marks appeared on trees at regular intervals, forming a trail that paralleled the direction they'd been moving. Jacob examined the marks and felt something cold settle in his stomach. These weren't old carvings from displaced Indians. The sap was fresh made recently. She was marking their route, creating a visible record of where they'd traveled, as though documenting their path for some future purpose. The pursuit had inverted. They thought they were hunting her, but she was tracking them, learning their patterns, watching from concealment while they crashed through underbrush. She navigated silently. That afternoon, they found the first cache. Hidden in a hollow cypress was a collection of items that made no sense. Their rope cut into measured lengths. Empty cartridge casings from their rifles, though no one remembered firing. A piece of cloth torn from Henry Burke's shirt, though he insisted his clothes were intact. The items were arranged deliberately, almost ritually, and above them, scratched into the tree's interior, was another symbol. William Tyson wanted to leave immediately. There was something wrong about the arrangement, something that suggested not panic, but purpose. They were dealing with someone who was collecting from them, documenting them, and the implications were deeply unsettling. But Jacob's pride wouldn't allow retreat. 5 armed overseers couldn't return to the plantation defeated by a girl they'd been sent to retrieve. The humiliation would destroy their authority, make them jokes among the enslaved population. They would find her, he insisted. And the punishment for this defiance would be severe enough to discourage future resistance. They pressed forward, but cohesion was fracturing. The younger overseers, startled at sounds, arguing about which direction to travel. The bottomlands seemed to shift around them. Pathways that appeared solid, dissolved into sucking mud. Dry ground they'd crossed earlier was now underwater. And the constant curtains of moss created an environment where visibility extended only a few feet in any direction. That evening they made camp again, this time posting all 5 men as watch. No one sleeping. They built the fire larger than necessary, pushed back the darkness, kept their rifles loaded and ready. The night sound seemed louder now, more deliberate. Something was moving through the forest around them, circling their position, staying just beyond firelight. Samuel Yarrow broke first. Around midnight, he stood suddenly and fired his rifle at movement in the darkness. The shot echoed through the swamp, and silence fell so completely it was like the forest was holding its breath. Then the normal sounds resumed. Insects, frogs, water moving over cypress roots. But in the morning they discovered where Samuel's bullet had gone. It had struck a tree 30 feet away, and embedded in the bark beside the bullet hole was one of their knives. The blade driven deep into the wood at exactly the height where Samuel had been sitting. The angle suggested it had been thrown from above from the tree canopy at the exact moment he'd fired blindly into darkness. The message was clear. She'd been directly above them. She could have struck any of them, but had chosen to respond to Samuel's aggression with a demonstration of precision rather than violence. She was showing them she had opportunities to harm them and was deliberately choosing not to. Yet, Jacob studied the knife and the bullet hole and understood with crystalline clarity that they were no longer in control of this situation. A girl they'd considered helpless had maneuvered them into terrain where every advantage they possessed, weapons, numbers, physical strength, meant nothing. She knew where they were at all times, could approach undetected, and was psychologically dismantling them with demonstrations of superiority. The question now wasn't whether they would catch her. The question was whether they would survive to leave the bottomlands at all. The third morning began with a discovery that shattered what remained of their confidence. Henry Burke's rifle was missing. Not taken in the night, he insisted he'd been holding it at dawn, but vanished during the few minutes they'd been breaking camp. One moment it was leaning against a tree. The next, it had disappeared. They searched frantically, spreading out despite Jacob's orders to stay together, and that's when the forest began to actively work against them. William Tyson stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground and plunged waist-deep into mud that sucked at him with surprising strength. While the others struggled to pull him free, Nathaniel Cruz discovered that several trees bore fresh markings, arrows pointing in different directions, as though offering them choices for routes forward. But when they followed one arrow, they found themselves at a creek they'd crossed earlier, somehow circling back. The other arrows led to similar dead ends, ground that seemed familiar, landmarks they'd passed before. She was hearing them, Jacob realized, keeping them moving, but controlling their direction, wearing them down physically and mentally. Their supplies were nearly exhausted. The food she'd taken the first night had been their reserve rations. They'd been drinking swamp water, risking illness. Nathaniel had developed a fever, shaking despite the humid heat. William's leg, injured during his plunge into the mud, was swelling badly. They were weakening while she remained invisible, untouched, orchestrating their deterioration. That afternoon, they heard singing, a woman's voice carrying through the forest from no identifiable direction, singing in a language none of them recognized. Creek words mixed with something else, a melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound disoriented them further, made it impossible to determine distances or directions. Samuel Yarrow finally snapped. He began screaming into the forest, cursing, promising terrible violence if she didn't show herself immediately. His voice cracked with fear, disguised as rage, and his brother couldn't calm him. The other men watched with hollow eyes, too exhausted for similar outbursts, understanding that Samuel's threats were meaningless. They had no authority here. The forest belonged to her, and they were intruders, being slowly consumed by their own inadequacy. As evening approached, they found themselves in a clearing they hadn't seen before, a small island of solid ground, surrounded by water on all sides. The ground was scattered with bones, animal remains mostly, but arranged in patterns that might have been natural or might have been deliberate. In the center of the clearing was a structure, a shelter built from branches and moss clearly inhabited recently. Inside the shelter, they found their missing supplies. Not all of them, but enough to survive. Dried meat, the stolen canteen, and Henry Burke's rifle unloaded, the ammunition scattered around it like decoration. It was an offering and a mockery simultaneously. She was demonstrating that she could provide for herself and control their access to resources, that she held their survival in her hands. Jacob made a decision born of desperation. They would wait here in this clearing, and she would have to come to them eventually. They had shelter, some supplies, and a defensible position. They couldn't win by pursuing her, but they might survive by staying still. But waiting in one place meant giving her complete initiative, meant sitting exposed while she watched from concealment, and the psychological strain was immediate. Every sound became a potential threat, every shadow a possible attack. The 5 men sat back to back in the clearing center, rifles pointing outward, waiting for movement that never came in ways they could predict. The attack, when it came, wasn't what they expected. Not violence, but escalating psychological warfare that exploited every fear they developed over 3 days in the bottomlands. It began at sunset, with sounds, footsteps circling their position, moving through water, always just beyond the clearing's edge. The sounds would approach, then retreat, never following predictable patterns. Sometimes the steps moved quickly, as though running. Other times they slowed to a deliberate pace that suggested someone moving with complete confidence through terrain that terrified the 5 men huddled in the clearing center. Then voices joined the footsteps, whispered words in languages they didn't understand, seeming to come from directly behind each man, even though they sat back to back. The words carried different tones, sometimes melodic like singing, other times harsh and guttural. Nathaniel swore he heard his own name spoken in his mother's voice, though his mother had been dead for 15 years. William insisted someone was reciting scripture, twisted verses that sounded almost right, but contained subtle blasphemies that made his skin cruel. Jacob tried to maintain order, reminding them these were tricks, psychological manipulation designed to break their resolve, but his voice carried less authority with each passing hour. And the other men responded with vacant stares that showed how thoroughly their confidence had eroded. Nathaniel, already feverish, became convinced something was moving beneath the water's surface, circling them like a predator. He began describing creatures he insisted he could see, forms that didn't match any animal he knew, watching from just below the waterline with eyes that reflected their firelight and colors no natural animal produced. The others told him he was hallucinating, fever-induced visions, but their voices carried uncertainty, and they found themselves watching the water with growing dread. Rifles pointed at ripples that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely. The moss curtains hanging from surrounding trees began to move, though there was no breeze. They swayed in rhythm altogether, then individually, creating patterns that seemed almost intentional. Henry Burke watched these movements with increasing agitation, convinced he could see shapes forming in the hanging vegetation. Human silhouettes that appeared and dissolved, always at the edge of his peripheral vision. Never quite solid enough to justify firing at, but too consistent to dismiss as imagination. Around midnight, the sounds changed. Now, it was laughter. A girl's laughter coming from multiple directions simultaneously, as though she'd multiplied or positioned herself impossibly in several locations at once. The laughter would start to their north, clear and distinct, then stop abruptly. Seconds later, it would resume from the south with the exact same tonal quality, the same rhythm, then east, then west, then from above, as though she was in the tree canopy directly over their heads. Samuel Yarrow broke formation, standing and firing his rifle repeatedly into the darkness, screaming that she was mocking them, that he'd show her what happened to people who defied their bets. His shots accomplished nothing except announcing their ammunition expenditure and creating muzzle flashes that destroyed their night vision temporarily. When the echoes faded and their eyes adjusted again, the laughter resumed, now holding a note of genuine amusement that cut deeper than any insult could have. Jacob grabbed his brother's arm, pulled him back down, hissed at him to conserve ammunition. But Samuel's eyes had taken on a wild quality, and he kept muttering about respect, about proper order, about teaching lessons. His grip on reality was slipping, Jacob realized, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. They were all slipping degree by degree into a psychological abyss where their fundamental assumptions about power and control dissolved completely. The fire began to behave strangely. It would flare suddenly, bright enough to illuminate the entire clearing, then die down to embers just as quickly, despite having plenty of fuel. During the bright flares, they could see the forest around them in detail, the water, the trees, the hanging moss, but never any sign of their tormentor. During the dim periods, the darkness pressed in so completely that they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. Henry noticed that during these darkness cycles, things moved in the clearing. Not large movements, but subtle shifts. A pack that had been to his left was now to his right. A rifle leaning against one tree was now against another. Small changes that suggested someone was entering their defended position during the moments they couldn't see, rearranging their possessions, demonstrating complete access to their space and belongings. Around 20 inches the morning, they heard singing again, but this time it wasn't distant or directionless. It came from the shelter in the clearing center, the structure where they'd found their supplies earlier. The voice was clear and close, singing in Creek words they couldn't understand, a melody that carried both sadness and strength. All 5 men turned to face the shelter, rifles raised, but the singing continued without pause. William suggested they fire into the structure, burn it down, force her into the open, but Jacob stopped him with a harsh whisper. If she was actually in there, if she'd somehow approached that close without them detecting her, then she wanted them to know it. She was showing them once again that she could reach them whenever she chose, and their weapons meant nothing. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt oppressive. They waited, barely breathing, for what would come next. Minutes passed, 510, nothing happened. The normal forest sounds had ceased entirely, as though every creature in the bottomlands was holding its breath, waiting for the same thing the 5 men waited for. Then something touched Jacob's shoulder. He spun, rifle raised, finger on the trigger, but there was nothing behind him except his brother who was facing the opposite direction. Yet he'd felt it clearly, a hand pressing down on his shoulder for just a moment. The unmistakable pressure of fingers through his shirt. Samuel insisted he hadn't moved, hadn't touched anyone, and the wild fear in his brother's eyes convinced Jacob he was telling the truth. Over the next hour, each man experienced similar contacts. A touch on the back of the neck, pressure against a leg, something brushing past an arm, always just at the edge of perception, always gone before they could react, always impossible to verify. They started arguing with each other, each man accusing the others of playing tricks, of trying to frighten companions for cruel amusement. But the accusations rang hollow because they could see each other, could verify that no one was moving enough to create these sensations. The psychological explanation was worse than any physical threat could have been. She was showing them that even sitting in a tight circle, facing outward with loaded weapons, they couldn't protect themselves from her presence. She moved among them like smoke, touching them at will, demonstrating that the barrier between hunter and prey had not just collapsed, but inverted completely. Dawn on the 4th day revealed that during the night she'd been in the clearing with them for far longer than those brief touches suggested. Each man's pack had been opened, and inside were gifts, flowers native to the bottomlands, arranged carefully. Swamp, hibiscus, pickerweed, spider leaves, all placed with almost delicate care. But mixed with the flowers were more disturbing items. Locks of hair that matched each man's color and texture, cut recently, not ripped out violently, but trimmed neatly, as though with scissors or a very sharp blade. The amount of hair suggested she'd been close enough to cut multiple strands from each man, close enough to touch their heads, to work carefully in darkness while they sat awake and supposedly vigilant. Strips of fabric from their clothing taken without them noticing. Henry's shirt was missing a piece from the hem. Samuel's trousers had a square cut from the inside of the leg where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Nathaniel's jacket was missing buttons he hadn't noticed were gone. And in Jacob's pack, a piece of paper salvaged from their supplies on which someone had drawn 5 figures. Simple stick figures, the kind a child might make, but rendered with enough detail to be identifiable. Each figure had characteristics that matched one of the overseers. Jacob's drawn taller than the others. Samuel positioned close to his brother, Nathaniel marked with symbols suggesting illness. 4 of the 5 figures were marked with X symbols over their chests, clear, deliberate crosses that needed no interpretation. The 5th figure, the one representing Jacob, bore no mark. It simply stood apart from the others, unfinished, questioning. The message was unmistakable. She'd been close enough to touch them, to take from them, to harm them if she'd chosen. The 4 marked figures represented a choice she hadn't yet made, and the unmarked 5th figure was a question. Who would she allow to survive? Jacob stared at the drawing and felt something fundamental break inside him. He'd built his entire identity on dominance, on the certainty that force and authority could control any situation. For 30 years, that belief had proven true. Enslaved people complied because they feared him. Other overseers deferred because they recognized superior strength. The entire social structure of plantation life reinforced his position at every turn. But here in this clearing, surrounded by evidence of his complete vulnerability, that certainty crumbled. He wasn't dealing with someone who feared him. He was dealing with someone who pied him enough to offer mercy he didn't deserve. And the psychological wound of that realization was deeper than any physical injury could have been. That morning, Nathaniel Cruz didn't wake up. His fever had progressed beyond the point where the body could fight it. His breathing had grown shallow during the night, and sometime before dawn, it simply stopped. They checked for pulse, found none, and sat staring at his body with hollow eyes. The first of them to die, killed not by violence, but by illness. Exacerbated by stress, dehydration, and the relentless psychological pressure of 3 days being hunted by prey, they couldn't catch. Jacob made the decision to leave him. They couldn't carry a dead man through the swamps, and staying meant they'd all die eventually. It was brutal calculus, survival arithmetic. Abandoning a companion's body because resources were finite, and sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. But leaving Nathaniel's corpse felt like crossing a line. They'd entered the forest as hunters, as men with power and purpose. Now they were abandoning their dead and fleeing like animals. All pretense of authority stripped away. Samuel insisted they should at least bury him. But Jacob pointed out the obvious. They had no tools, the ground was too wet, and spending hours digging would only give her more time to orchestrate whatever came next. They left Nathaniel in the clearing with what water remained, a meaningless gesture toward humanity, and continued moving. But now they were 4, weakened, and the psychological weight of abandonment added to their deterioration. Each man was thinking the same thing, though none would voice it aloud. Who would be next? Whose body would they leave in some future clearing? Over the next hours, the forest seemed to tighten around them. The paths grew narrower, the water deeper, the solid ground less frequent. They moved single file through passages barely wide enough for their bodies, cypress roots grabbing at their legs like deliberate obstacles, mud sucking at their boots with every step, as though the earth itself wanted to hold them in place. Henry Burke, walking point, kept encountering paths that seemed solid but dissolved into waist-deep water after a few steps. He'd test the ground carefully, declare it safe, take 3 paces, and plunge into hidden pools. After the 5th time, his confidence was completely shattered, and he refused to continue leading. But Jacob at the rear insisted someone had to break trail, and rank still meant something even here, even now. William Tyson's injured leg finally gave out around midday. He collapsed into water that came to his chest, unable to stand. And when the others tried to lift him, the ground beneath them shifted, destabilizing everyone. His leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin discolored in ways that suggested serious infection. He needed medical attention, bed rest, clean water, antibiotics that wouldn't be widely available for another 60 years. What he had was 3 desperate men trying to keep him upright in a swamp that wanted to pull him down. They struggled for 10 minutes, maybe 15, trying to find footing solid enough to support his weight. But the more they moved, the deeper they sank. Jacob finally made the same calculation he'd made with Nathaniel. William was slowing them down, using energy they couldn't spare, and his condition would only worsen. Henry and Samuel looked at Jacob with horror, understanding what he was suggesting before he voiced it aloud. William understood too. He stopped fighting, stopped trying to stand, and looked at each of them in turn. His expression held no accusation, just resignation. He'd known this was coming since his leg gave out, had felt his companion's desperation growing with each failed attempt to move him. "Go," he said quietly. "She's watching anyway. Staying just means she takes all of us." In the confusion of trying to find stable ground to continue from, in the desperate scramble to extract themselves from the mud that held them, William Tyson slipped away. Not attacked? Not pulled under by anything except gravity and water and his body's inability to fight anymore. They heard him thrashing, calling for help with decreasing volume, and then nothing. The swamp had claimed him with almost casual efficiency, and none of them had the physical or moral strength to attempt another rescue. They were 3 now, Jacob, Samuel, and Henry, moving through a nightmare landscape that seemed actively hostile to their presence. Their ammunition was nearly gone. They'd wasted shots firing at sounds and shadows. Their food was exhausted. Their water supply was contaminated swamp water that would likely make them sick. They were lost, unable to retrace their route, unable to determine which direction led to the plantation they'd left what felt like years ago, but had only been 4 days. The trees around them bore constant markings now. Creek symbols they couldn't read but understood were messages. Some seemed to point directions offering guidance. Others appeared more ominous, warnings perhaps, or simply documentation of their passage. She was creating a record, they realized, marking this hunt the way hunters mark successful tracking. Except in this case, the prey was creating the record of the hunter's failure. That afternoon, exhausted and delirious, they emerged into another clearing and found Celia waiting for them. She stood on the far side of a small pond, perfectly visible in afternoon sunlight that filtered through the cypress canopy. She made no attempt to hide or run. She simply stood there, solid and real after days of being everywhere and nowhere, finally allowing them to see her clearly. She looked nothing like the terrified runaway they'd expected to catch. Her clothes were muddy but intact, practical garments that allowed free movement. Her face bore patterns drawn in what looked like charcoal mixed with clay, not random marks, but deliberate designs that might have been camouflage or might have been ceremonial. Her hair was pulled back and tied with plant fibers. She was barefoot, her feet showing none of the damage theirs had sustained from days walking on roots and through mud. Most striking was her expression. Not fear, not anger, not even triumph, just calm assessment, the look of someone evaluating a situation with complete confidence in their ability to handle whatever developed. In her hands, she held a bow constructed from materials in the forest, the kind of hunting implement her Creek ancestors had used for generations. The wood was bent perfectly. The string appeared to be woven plant fiber or sinew, and the arrow, nocked but not drawn, looked professionally made, with stone tip and feather fletching. She'd built a functional weapon from natural materials while staying ahead of 5 armed men. Behind her, arranged on the ground, were their missing items. The rope they'd carried in, now fashioned into snares and traps. The ammunition she'd taken lined up in a neat row. Henry's missing rifle unloaded and disassembled into components, and their knives arranged in patterns that suggested she'd been studying the weapons, learning their construction and weaknesses. For a long moment, no one moved. The 3 men stood frozen at the clearing's edge, rifles raised but uncertain, facing this girl who'd orchestrated their destruction without ever resorting to direct violence. She'd let the forest do the work, had simply guided them into situations where their own mistakes and the environment's dangers combined fatally. Jacob Yarrow found his voice first. "You've had your fun," he said, trying to inject authority into words that came out and cracked. "But it ends here. You're coming back with us, and you'll face punishment for this." Celia tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same calm assessment. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily across the small pond. Her accent blended Creek influences with the regional dialect of Georgia, marking her as someone who existed between worlds. "Punishment," she said, "for running when you intended harm, for surviving when you intended capture, for knowing my mother's land better than you know your own greed." Samuel Yarrow stepped forward, raising his rifle more deliberately. "You killed Nathaniel and William. That's murder, and you'll hang for it." "I killed no one," Celia replied calmly. "Your friend died of fever you couldn't treat. The other drowned in water he couldn't escape. I touched neither of them. The forest took them because they didn't belong here, didn't understand how to move through it safely, just as it will take you if you don't leave now." Jacob raised his rifle, sighted carefully down the barrel, his hands shaking from exhaustion, but his intention clear. After everything, the humiliation, the deaths, the complete dismantling of his authority, he would end this here, one shot, and the problem would be solved. They could claim she'd attacked them, that it was self-defense, that the other deaths had been her doing. The story would be believed because the alternative that they'd been defeated by a girl who never raised a hand in violence was too humiliating for anyone to accept. He pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. A mechanical failure caused by 4 days of exposure to swamp water, mud in the barrel, moisture in the powder. The click of the hammer falling on a dead cartridge was the loudest sound in the clearing. Celia drew her bow in response. The movement fluid and practiced, and released in one smooth motion. The arrow struck the ground 6 inches in front of Jacob's right foot, embedding itself in soft earth at an angle that demonstrated absolute precision. She'd aimed exactly where she'd intended, showing that she could have struck him center mass if she'd chosen, that his life continued only because she permitted it. She had another arrow nocked before any of them could react. This one drawn partially, ready to release fully if they moved against her. 4 men entered these bottomlands, she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying an edge that made clear she was done being patient. 2 are dead from their own inability to survive here. 2 more can join them, or 1 can walk out alive and carry a message back to Gresham and anyone else who thinks ownership is stronger than knowledge. She gestured at the items arranged behind her, their possessions, their weapons, everything they'd brought into the forest, now under her control. I could have killed you the first night," she continued. "Cut throats while you slept, pushed you into deep water, any of 100 ways this forest offers. I didn't because I wanted you to understand something before you died or left. You don't own the forest. You don't own people who know it better than you. You don't own anything except your ignorance. And that ignorance is what killed your friends." Henry Burke broke first. The accumulation of 4 days, the psychological warfare, the deaths, the complete inversion of power had pushed him past his breaking point. He dropped his rifle like it burned. His hands turned and ran, crashing back through the passage they'd emerged from, fleeing with the last reserves of his strength. Branches whipped his face, roots caught his feet, water splashed waist high, and he didn't care. He just ran, driven by pure animal terror. Samuel hesitated, looking at his brother, loyalty wearing with survival instinct. Jacob's face showed no emotion now, just exhaustion and the hollow recognition of complete defeat. Samuel made his choice. He'd followed his brother into this disaster, but he wouldn't follow him into death. He turned and ran after Henry, abandoning Jacob in the clearing with the girl who destroyed them all without raising a hand in violence. Jacob Yarrow stood alone, facing Celia across the pond, his useless rifle hanging from hands that no longer had the strength to raise it. He understood with perfect clarity that he'd lost everything. Authority, reputation, even basic survival advantage. He was an intruder in her domain, and she was offering him mercy he didn't deserve. Mercy that would taste like ash for whatever remained of his life. "Why?" he asked, and his voice sounded like a stranger's. "Why let any of us live?" Celia lowered her bow slightly, but kept the arrow nocked. "Because dead men don't carry messages. Someone needs to tell Gresham what happened here. Someone needs to tell the other overseers. Someone needs to make them understand that running doesn't always mean you're prey, and hunting doesn't always mean you're in control." She paused, then added something that would haunt Jacob Yarrow for whatever time remained to him. "My mother taught me to read this forest the way you read account books. Every plant, every sound, every shift in wind or water, they all speak if you know how to listen. She taught me because she knew this day might come, because she understood that knowledge is the only power that can't be taken by force. You entered my classroom with guns, expecting weakness. You found strength you didn't know existed because you never bothered to look for it." She gestured toward the passage Henry and Samuel had taken. "Walk away. Tell your story. Maybe someone will learn something, though I doubt it. Men like you don't learn from losing. You just find new ways to convince yourselves you didn't really lose." Jacob wanted to say something, wanted to salvage some shred of dignity from this disaster, but there was nothing left to salvage. He was a man who defined himself by dominance and control, and both had been stripped away so thoroughly he barely recognized himself. He turned and followed his companions, leaving his rifle behind because it was useless weight now, stumbling through the swamp with no dignity left, just the animal desperation to survive long enough to reach familiar ground. Behind him, he heard Celia's voice one final time, carrying clearly through the forest. "The Bottomlands remember, and I remember. If Gresham sends more men, I'll be here, and next time none walk out." Henry Burke emerged from the Ojai Bottomlands 36 hours after the 3 survivors separated in the clearing. He crawled out of the treeing on his hands and knees, delirious, covered in mud and scratches that formed patterns across his skin like writing in a language no one could read. His clothes were torn, his boots were gone, his hands were bleeding from countless cuts sustained, grabbing at roots and branches during his flight. Plantation workers found him near the eastern property line around dawn, babbling about forests that moved and girls who multiplied and water that consumed. They carried him to the overseer's quarters, tried to get coherent information from him, but he couldn't form complete sentences. He kept repeating fragments. "She was everywhere, in the trees, under the water behind us. She touched us while we watched. The forest listened to her. The forest listened." Thomas Gresham summoned a doctor from the county seat, a man experienced with fever and delirium, who examined Burke thoroughly and declared him physically intact, but mentally shattered. The scratches covering his body were superficial, the product of running blindly through underbrush. His dehydration was severe, but treatable. His psychological state was another matter entirely. For 3 days, Burke remained in a semi-conscious state, waking periodically to scream about things pursuing him, then collapsing into exhausted sleep. When he finally regained enough clarity to speak coherently, his testimony was so disturbing that Gresham initially refused to believe it. Burke described 4 days of systematic psychological dismantling. He spoke of a girl who moved through the forest like smoke, who seemed to be in multiple places simultaneously, who demonstrated complete control over terrain that defeated 5 armed men. He insisted she'd been close enough to touch them repeatedly, that she'd stolen from them while they watched, that the forest itself had somehow aligned with her against them. She knew, Burke kept repeating, she knew everything. Where we'd step, where we'd look, what we'd do next. It was like she'd run this hunt 100 times before, knew every mistake we'd make before we made it. When Gresham pressed him about the other 4 overseers, Burke's face went blank, and he stared at nothing for several minutes before answering. Nathaniel died of fever. William drowned. Jacob and Samuel. I don't know. I ran. When she gave us the choice, I ran. Gresham organized a search party the next day. 10 men from neighboring plantations, none of them his own enslaved workers, all carrying rifles and supplied for a week in the forest. They entered the bottomlands with detailed instructions about where the 5 overseers had been heading, with Burke's rough descriptions of landmarks he remembered. They found Samuel Yarrow's body 3 days into the search, face down in a shallow creek 2 miles from the plantation boundary. The water was barely deep enough to cover his chest, but he lay in it motionless, already showing signs of decomposition in the humid heat. The coroner who examined the body found no signs of violence, no wounds, no evidence of struggle. Samuel had simply collapsed from exhaustion in water too shallow to pose a drowning threat to anyone with the strength to lift their head, and he hadn't had that strength remaining. The search party refused to go deeper into the bottomlands after finding Samuel. They reported that the terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate, that landmarks seemed to shift, that they'd found symbols carved into trees in patterns they couldn't interpret. Several men reported feeling watched constantly, hearing sounds that didn't match any animal they recognized, finding their supplies rearranged when they made camp despite posting guards. After 5 days, Gresham called off the search. 3 men were still missing: Jacob Yarrow, William Tyson, and Nathaniel Cruz. But the risk of losing more people searching for bodies outweighed the value of recovery. The official county records would list all 3 as lost to swamp conditions, a vague phrase that avoided uncomfortable questions about how experienced overseers could be defeated by wilderness and a runaway girl. Jacob Yarrow's fate remained unknown for another 2 weeks until hunters from a neighboring county reported finding remains in the deep bottomlands 6 miles from where the search party had stopped. The body was too decomposed for positive identification, but the clothing fragments and a distinctive pocket watch confirmed it was Jacob. He'd apparently continued walking after the clearing confrontation, perhaps trying to find his own way out, perhaps simply refusing to follow his brother and Burke. Whatever his reasoning, he'd walked deeper into the swamp instead of toward safety, and the forest had claimed him. William Tyson and Nathaniel Cruz were never found. Their bodies presumably remained in the swamp, consumed by scavengers and decay, absorbed into the ecosystem that had defeated them. The bottomlands had a way of erasing people completely, leaving no trace beyond the memories of those who'd known them. Henry Burke remained at the Gresham plantation for 2 more weeks after emerging from the forest, recovering physically while his psychological state deteriorated further. He slept poorly when he slept at all, jerking awake at sounds no one else heard, staring at shadows no one else saw. He refused to go near the eastern property line, wouldn't even look toward the treeing that marked where civilization ended and the bottomlands began. The enslaved workers at Gresham's plantation watched Burke's decline with expressions that mixed satisfaction with something deeper. Validation, perhaps, that the power structure they suffered under was more fragile than it appeared. Overseer Burke, who'd wielded authority with casual cruelty for 2 years, now jumped at bird calls and drew symbols in the dirt compulsively whenever he thought no one was watching. Those symbols became a source of whispered conversation among the enslaved population. They were creek markings. Some people recognized them from interactions with indigenous people before their removal. Others insisted they were older than that, symbols that predated European contact entirely, meanings lost even to the creek themselves. Whatever their origin, Burke drew them constantly. The same patterns he'd seen on trees in the bottomlands, copying them with obsessive precision, as though trying to decode a message meant for someone else. When Burke finally left Wilkinson County, he told anyone who'd listened that they'd been hunted from the moment they entered the bottomlands. Not attacked, he'd clarify when people misunderstood, but hunted in a way that was somehow worse than violence. studied, cataloged, guided into situations where their own weaknesses destroyed them. She never had to hurt us, Burke would say, his voice carrying an edge of awe mixed with terror. The forest hurt us. Our ignorance hurt us. She just watched, guided, made sure we encountered every danger we were too stupid to avoid on our own. Most people dismiss Burke's testimony as fever dreams, the confused memories of a man who'd experienced genuine trauma and was processing it through exaggeration and fantasy. But those who'd spent time in the bottomlands, who knew how treacherous that terrain could be, heard something different in his words. Recognition that knowledge of environment could be weaponized, that someone who truly understood wilderness could manipulate it in ways that seemed impossible to outsiders. Burke eventually settled in Alabama, taking work as a cleaner in a general store, refusing all offers to return to overseer work. He lived another 33 years, dying in 1872. And throughout his life, he maintained that what happened in the Ojai Bottomlands in October 1839 was the most terrifying experience a human being could endure. Not because of violence or monsters, but because it revealed how thoroughly helpless people could become when they ventured into environments they didn't understand. Pursuing People Way. Oh, did Celia was never seen again at the Gresham plantation. Thomas Gresham filed a formal runaway report with county authorities describing her age, appearance, and the circumstances of her flight, but no serious effort was made to recover her. The local sheriff, when asked to organize a pursuit, pointed out that 5 overseers had failed to bring her back, and 4 had died in the attempt. What exactly did Gresham expect a sheriff's deputy to accomplish? Gresham couldn't articulate an answer that didn't sound absurd. How could he explain that he needed his runaway caught not because of her labor value, but because letting her escape successfully would undermine his authority with the remaining enslaved workers? How could he admit that his entire operation depended on people believing escape was impossible? And one successful flight demonstrated otherwise. The enslaved population at Gresham's plantation noted Celia's disappearance with expressions of quiet satisfaction that they were careful to hide from remaining white authority among themselves in the few moments when surveillance lapsed. They passed stories about what had happened in the forest. The details grew with each retelling, acquiring mythological elements, but the core remained consistent. One of their number had faced the overseer's worst intentions and emerged victorious, had turned hunters into prey using nothing but knowledge her mother had passed down. Knowledge that predated slavery and plantations and overseers entirely. The story spread to neighboring plantations through networks of communication that slaveholders didn't know existed or vastly underestimated. Within a month, enslaved workers across Wilkinson County knew some version of what had happened when 5 overseers pursued a Creek girl into the bottomlands. The specifics varied. Some versions had Celia killing the overseers directly. Others had the forest itself rising against them. A few suggested supernatural intervention, but they all carried the same essential message. Resistance was possible, escape was achievable, and knowledge could overcome force. Thomas Gresham's plantation declined rapidly after October 1839. Though the connection to the Bottomlands incident wasn't immediately obvious to outsiders, his more astute neighbors recognized the pattern. Small acts of resistance from enslaved workers that compounded daily. Subtle degradations of efficiency that added up to significant production losses, and most critically, an unwillingness among potential overseers to work for Gresham regardless of salary offered. Word had spread through overseer networks about what happened to Yarrow and his crew. The specific details were disputed, but the outcome was clear. Gresham's plantation was where overseers went to die or go mad. The few men who inquired about positions asked pointed questions about the bottomlands, about runaway procedures, about what exactly had happened to the previous overseers. When they heard Gresham's evasive answers, they found employment elsewhere. Without overseers willing to enforce discipline through fear, Gresham couldn't maintain the brutal efficiency that cotton production demanded. His yields dropped 20% in 1840, 30% in 1841. His enslaved workers weren't overtly rebellious. They showed up for work. They performed their assigned tasks, but they did so at their own pace, with their own standards, and Gresham had no mechanism to compel anything more. He tried managing directly, taking on some overseer duties himself, but he was one man attempting to control 37 people who'd learned they could resist in ways that were impossible to punish. Tools disappeared and reappeared. Cotton bales were lighter than they should be. The missing pounds somehow lost between field and weighing. Fences needed constant repair. Equipment broke with suspicious frequency. By 1842, Gresham was bankrupt. He sold the plantation at a devastating loss to a speculator from South Carolina who had no knowledge of its history and wouldn't learn about the Bottomlands incident until after completing the purchase. The new owner attempted to restore profitability through renewed brutality, hiring overseers with fearsome reputations, but they encountered the same resistance Gresham had faced. Not open rebellion, but passive defiance so consistent it was impossible to combat. The plantation changed hands 3 more times over the next 8 years. Each owner discovering that the land itself seemed cursed, that enslaved workers here were somehow different from those at neighboring operations, more resistant, less controllable. None of them connected this resistance to events in 1839 to a girl who demonstrated that authority could be overthrown through knowledge rather than violence. The Ojai Bottomlands retained their dangerous reputation after the overseer deaths, but the nature of that danger evolved in local storytelling. It wasn't just treacherous terrain anymore. It was territory that had declared independence from the plantation system, land where the normal rules didn't apply, where escaped people could disappear and white authority couldn't follow. This mythology served practical purposes. It discouraged pursuit of runaways who fled east toward the swamps. It created psychological barriers that were more effective than physical ones, making the Bottomlands seem so dangerous that sending search parties appeared futile. And most importantly, it suggested that certain areas existed outside the control of the system that defined the antebellum South, spaces where different rules applied. Whether Celia actually remained in the Bottomlands or traveled farther was impossible to confirm, but reports persisted for decades of travelers being guided through the swamps by a woman who appeared from the forest, led them to safety, then vanished without giving her name. These accounts were remarkably consistent across time. The guide was always described as mixed Creek and African heritage, always demonstrating extraordinary knowledge of the terrain, always refusing payment or thanks, always disappearing before questions could be asked. Historians who've examined these reports generally dismiss them as folk tales, the kind of mythology that grows around wilderness areas where actual disappearances occurred. They point out that the descriptions remain too consistent across decades, suggesting a shared cultural narrative rather than independent observations of a real person who would have aged visibly over that time span. But oral histories preserved by Creek and African communities tell a different story. They describe the Bottomlands as hosting a small population of escaped people who'd created a semi-permanent settlement in the deep swamps, living off the land using techniques passed down from indigenous ancestors, occasionally helping other runaways reach safety farther north. These accounts name Celia specifically as one of the settlement's founders, someone who used her experience evading overseers to establish pathways and protocols for others. Whether these oral histories document facts or wishful thinking is ultimately unprovable. No physical evidence of such a settlement has been found, though the Bottomlands' hostile preservation conditions would destroy most structures within years. No written records from the period mention organized runaway communities in the Ojai swamps, though slaveholders had strong incentives to suppress such information if they knew about it. What is documented, verifiable in multiple sources, is that the Wilkinson County region experienced an unusually high rate of successful escapes between 1,840 and 1,860. Enslaved people from plantations bordering the Bottomlands disappeared with far greater frequency than those farther west, and pursuit efforts recovered far fewer runaways than in comparable Georgia counties. Something about that area made escape more viable, whether it was simply the terrain itself or the presence of people who'd mastered living within it. The court records from October 1839 remain incomplete, many pages mysteriously missing from the county archives. What survives is fragmentary testimony from Henry Burke, depositions taken while he was still recovering, describing events that the court clear noted seemed impossible to credit, yet delivered with such conviction as to suggest genuine belief in their accuracy. Burke's descriptions painted a picture of systematic psychological warfare. A girl who moved through the forest with preternatural skill, who seemed to anticipate every action the overseers took, who demonstrated complete mastery over terrain that killed them. He described her building weapons from natural materials, navigating in absolute darkness, approaching them repeatedly without detection, and ultimately offering mercy they didn't deserve. The court, after reviewing Burke's testimony and examining Samuel and Jacob Yarrow's remains, concluded that all deaths resulted from natural causes exacerbated by poor judgment. The verdict specifically stated, the deceased entered hostile terrain without adequate preparation, pursued a quarry who possessed superior knowledge of said terrain, and subsequently perished through exposure, exhaustion, and environmental hazards. No evidence suggests deliberate violence. The runaway Negro girl, Celia, is charged with flight, but cannot be held responsible for deaths that resulted from the pursuers' inadequate skills. This verdict was remarkable for its time, acknowledging that enslaved people could possess knowledge superior to their captives, and that pursuing them without respect for that knowledge carried fatal consequences. Some historians suggest the verdict reflected the court's discomfort with the implications of ruling differently, with admitting that a teenage girl had defeated 5 armed overseers through strategic superiority rather than luck. The symbolism of the verdict wasn't lost on the enslaved population throughout Georgia. Legal acknowledgement that knowledge could overcome force, that understanding terrain mattered more than weapons, spread through communication networks and became part of the broader resistance culture. The story of Celia and the Bottomlands joined other narratives of successful resistance, teaching lessons about how to survive, how to fight back, how to win on terms the oppressor system didn't understand. Thomas Gresham died in 1,851 inches, Texas, where he'd relocated after selling his Georgia plantation. He'd attempted to restart cotton operations in the new territory, but encountered similar problems. Workers who resisted subtly, overseers who quit without explanation, yields that never matched expectations. His obituary in the Houston newspaper made no mention of his Georgia plantation or the events of October 1839, describing him as a farmer of moderate success whose ambitions exceeded his luck. Henry Burke died in 1,872 inches, Alabama, as mentioned, having lived 33 years after emerging from the Bottomlands. His obituary noted his service as a store clerk and his reputation for peculiar views regarding wilderness areas and their dangers. Family members reported that he'd never spoken of his overseer years except to warn them against pursuing work that required entering unfamiliar forests, and that he'd kept drawings hidden in his personal effects. Symbols he'd copied from trees in Georgia decades earlier, preserved as though they held, meaning he'd spent his life trying to decode. The ultimate question, what truly happened in the Ojai Bottomlands in October 1839, remains subject to interpretation. The physical evidence is straightforward. 5 men entered, 4 died from environmental causes, 1 emerged, psychologically shattered. The girl they pursued was never recovered. No violence was proven, no supernatural occurrence documented. But the psychological and social impacts were profound and lasting. The incident demonstrated that knowledge of environment could be weaponized effectively. That pursuit didn't guarantee capture. That people dismissed as powerless could defeat those presumed superior through strategic thinking and terrain mastery. These lessons rippled outward, influencing how enslaved people thought about resistance, how slaveholders thought about control, and how Southern society understood the supposed inevitability of its power structure. The story spread far beyond Wilkinson County, carried by enslaved people sold to other regions, by overseers who heard cautionary tales from colleagues, by travelers who'd heard locals discuss the mysterious Bottomlands. In each retelling, the specific details shifted, but the core remained. A girl pursued by 5 armed men had survived, and her pursuers hadn't. And that inversion of expected outcomes revealed possibilities that the plantation system depended on people not recognizing. Modern historians studying antebellum resistance culture often cite the Celia incident as an example of how individual acts of survival became collective mythology, how specific events transformed into broader lessons about power and knowledge. Whether every detail of the story, as preserved in oral histories, is factual matters less than what the story accomplished, demonstrating that resistance was possible, that oppressors could be defeated, that knowledge passed down from ancestors could be more powerful than any weapon. The Bottomlands themselves remained dangerous territory long after 1839, claiming other lives over the decades, but they also remained a symbol of places beyond the plantation system's control, of knowledge that couldn't be stolen or destroyed, of resistance that didn't require violence, but could be just as effective. And sometimes, even today, people hiking through what remains of the Ojai Bottomlands report feeling watched, hearing sounds that don't match any known animal, finding symbols carved into old-growth trees that look too deliberate to be natural damage. Are these residual traces of historical events, or simply the mind's tendency to find patterns and meaning in wilderness spaces? The answer probably depends on whether you believe knowledge of forests and survival skills passed through generations can leave impressions on landscape itself, or whether you think all such phenomena are just stories we tell ourselves about places where remarkable things happened long ago. What do you think happened in those Georgia bottomlands? Do you believe it was simply environmental hazards and superior knowledge of terrain, or was there something more profound in how the forest claimed 4 overseers? Do you think Celia survived in the wilderness? Or did she perhaps help establish communities of escaped people living beyond the plantation system's reach? Leave your comments below and share your theories. If you found this historical account compelling, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Dark tales from America's past, where the official records tell one story, but the deeper truth reveals something far more complex. Share this video with someone who appreciates narratives of survival against impossible odds. And check out our other videos exploring forgotten histories that challenge our assumptions about power, resistance, and how people survive systems designed to destroy them. The forest guards its secrets well, yet together, we will continue to peel back the layers of what history tried to hide. Some truths are not lost by accident, they are buried on purpose, because they threaten those who profit from carefully crafted official stories. Still, these memories refuse to die. They survive through whispers, broken records, and the voices of ancestors, waiting for those brave enough to seek what truly happened. This was a moment when knowledge stood against brute force, when the land itself became a weapon, and when the hunted transformed into something far more fearsome than those who chased her could ever comprehend. Until our next journey into the shadows, stay curious, stay aware. See you in the next video.